What would you do if the only thing you could afford in this world was a memory? If all you had left was a single silver dollar, a grief so heavy it felt like stone in your pocket, and the deed to a place everyone called a tomb. For 18-year-old Ruthie Callahan, standing on the dusty main street of Dustfall, California, in the summer of 1876, this wasn't a question. It was the stark and brutal truth of her life. She had just spent her last dollar to buy a collapsed and forgotten gold mine, a place the county clerk called Gideon's Folly. But the truth waiting inside that broken earth was a secret far heavier than gold. A story of justice so long buried that only the hands of an orphan, with nothing left to lose, could ever hope to unearth it. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this is a story about the patience of stone and the enduring weight of a hidden truth. Ruthie Callahan arrived in Dustfall with little more than the clothes on her back, her father's worn pickaxe, and a silence that had settled deep in her bones. The fever had taken her mother first, swift and merciless. Her father, a man who had spent his life reading the language of rock and seam, had followed a week later, his powerful hands finally still. They had buried them both in a small plot overlooking the dry wash, the scent of fresh-cut pine from the coffins, a final sharp memory that clung to Ruthie like the dust of the road. She was alone now, a fact as vast and indifferent as the Sierra sky above. The town saw her as a ghost, a relic of a family that had come seeking a fortune and found only a grave. They looked through her, their gazes sliding past as if she were made of smoke. After the doctor and the undertaker were paid, she was left with a single silver dollar, its edges worn smooth with the hopes of 1,000 other hands. At the county clerk's office, a stuffy room that smelled of aging paper and stale tobacco, she asked to see the claims ledger. The clerk, a man with a stained vest and a perpetually bored expression, sighed. "Nothing worth having, girl. Everything good was pulled from these hills 30 years ago." He pushed the heavy book across the counter. The pages were a graveyard of failed dreams, names crossed out, claims marked abandoned or forfeit. Most were priced for pennies on the dollar, legal scraps meant to clear the county's books. Her finger traced down the list of forgotten names until it stopped on one: Gideon's Folly. The price listed next to it was $1. "That one," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The clerk chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "The Folly? Child, that mine collapsed before you were born. Killed the man who dug it. They say it was tapped out anyway. You'd be buying a headstone is all." Ruthie looked at the coin in her palm. A headstone for $1 felt like a fair price for the end of a world. "I'll take it," she murmured. The men loafing by the stove snickered. The transaction was swift. A few scratches of a pen, the thump of a rubber stamp, and the deed was hers. It was a single sheet of brittle yellowed paper. The ink faded to a ghostly brown. It declared her the sole owner of a plot of land no one wanted, and a hole in the ground everyone mocked. As she walked out, the clerk's words followed her. $1 for a tomb. Seems fitting." She clutched the paper in her hand, the sharp corners digging into her palm. It wasn't a tomb. It was the only thing on earth that belonged to her. The deed felt impossibly light in her hand, a whisper of ownership for a place of ruin. In the town's memory, Gideon's Folly was less a mine and more a cautionary tale told to greenhorns and children. The story went that old Gideon Hale was a stubborn fool who chased a phantom vein, digging deeper and deeper into unstable shale until the mountain finally shrugged and took him, burying him under 1,000 tons of rock and shattered timber. They said he'd found nothing, that his obsession had left him with empty pockets and an early grave. The mine was a monument to failure, a scar on the hillside that served as a warning against hope. Ruthie folded the paper and tucked it into the pocket of her worn dress. She knew what she needed, not pity, not advice, but supplies. At the general store, the smells of canvas, coffee, and salted pork filled the air. The proprietor watched her with wary eyes as she gathered a small sack of flour, a tin of coffee, a side of bacon, and a few precious candles. She had no money, but she had her father's pickaxe. It was a beautiful tool, the head forged from fine steel, the hickory handle worn smooth and dark with the sweat of 1,000 days of labor. She set it on the counter. "I need to trade," she said. Before the man could refuse, a voice spoke from the back of the store. "Her credit is good." It was Silas Croft, a man whose face was a roadmap of creases and kindness. He had been her father's closest friend, a fellow prospector who had seen the good times and the bad. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "A Callahan's word is better than coin in this town, Ruthie. Always has been." He paid for her supplies and walked her outside. He didn't ask what she was doing. He didn't offer condolences that felt like empty echoes. He simply looked at the deed she held. "Gideon's Folly," he read, his voice low. "Your father ever mentioned that mine?" Ruthie shook her head. "He said some ground is just sad. Best to let it be." Silas nodded slowly. "Maybe so. But your father also said that rock holds memory. You'll need more than a pickaxe." He led her to the livery, to a stall in the far back where a gray-muzzled mule stood, patient and still. "This is old Job. He's slow, but he's steady, and he knows the weight of things." He handed her the lead rope. The mule was the first kindness she'd been shown since her parents died, a quiet, breathing warmth in a world that had turned to cold stone. With Job packed with her meager supplies, she was ready. She looked up at the foothills, a rumple of brown and green under the hard blue sky. Somewhere up there was her inheritance, a hole in the ground, a memory, a tomb. Was it foolishness born of grief, a desperate attempt to claim something in a world that had taken everything? Or was it a faith deeper than rock, a stubborn belief that something of value could still be found in a place everyone else had abandoned? What secret did the mountain hold that the whole world had forgotten? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story speaks to you, please consider subscribing for more tales of the forgotten frontier. Because when Ruthie Callahan finally reached the mine's collapsed mouth, the silence that greeted her was not empty. It was waiting. The news of her purchase traveled through dustfall on whispers and wry smiles. The girl who bought a grave. The orphan who traded her last dollar for a pile of worthless rock. She became a story, a piece of local color, another fool drawn to the promise of the hills only to be broken by them. As she walked old Job through the center of town on her way out, the whispers were like the rustle of dry leaves. Men on the saloon porch stopped their conversations to watch her pass, their eyes a mixture of pity and contempt. Women behind curtained windows shook their heads. She kept her gaze fixed on the dusty road ahead, her face a mask of quiet resolve. Her father had taught her that. "Let the talk blow by you like the wind," he'd say. "It can't move you unless you let it." But some wind was stronger than others. Outside the assayer's office stood Judge Thaddeus Sterling. He was the most powerful man in the county, a large, imposing figure whose wealth had come not from digging in the dirt, but from the paper that claimed it. He owned the biggest ranch, the town's only hotel, and the bank. His word was law, and his smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He stepped into her path, forcing her to stop. "Miss Callahan," he said, his voice a low boom that carried across the street. "I hear you've made an investment." He gestured vaguely toward the hills. "Gideon's Folly. A bold choice." His lips twisted into a smirk. "My father used to say that a fool and his money are soon parted. But to part with your last dollar for a collapsed shaft, that's not foolishness. That's poetry." The men with him chuckled. Ruthie said nothing. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. The silence stretched, and his amusement began to curdle into irritation. He was a man used to deference, to people shrinking under his gaze. Her stillness was an act of defiance he couldn't abide. "It's a tomb, girl," he sneered, his voice losing its false gentility. "A fitting place for a family with no future. Don't come crying to me when the mountain reminds you of that." He turned and walked away, his pronouncement hanging in the air. Ruthie took a breath and clicked her tongue for old job to move on. She left the town and its judgment behind, following a faint track that wound its way up into the chaparral. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine and dust. As the trail curved around a thicket of manzanita, she saw a woman sitting by a small, clear stream. She was old, her face a beautiful testament to the sun and the years, her dark hair woven with threads of silver. It was Ilara, a Miwok woman whose people had lived in these hills long before the first prospectors had arrived with their picks and their greed. She rarely came to town, and when she did, she moved with a quiet dignity that seemed to make the noisy bustle of dustfall hold its breath. Ilara looked up as Ruthie approached, her dark eyes seeming to see not just a grieving girl, but the entire history that had led her to this path. She didn't speak for a long moment, simply watching. Then, in a voice as soft as moss, she said one thing. "That hill remembers. It holds the debt." Ruthie stopped, the words settling over her with a strange weight. She didn't know what they meant, but they felt like a truth, solid and real in a way the town's mockery was not. She nodded to the old woman, a gesture of respect, and continued on her way, the cryptic sentence echoing in her mind. A debt. What debt could a mountain possibly hold? The journey to the mine was a slow climb into solitude. The trail dwindled from a wagon track to a narrow deer path, the world of dustfall shrinking behind her until it was just a smudge of heat and noise in the valley below. Here, the only sounds were the plodding hoof-falls of old Job, the buzz of insects in the dry grass, and the sigh of the wind through the ponderosa pines. The sun was relentless, beating down on her head and shoulders, but Ruthie barely noticed. She was walking in the footsteps of her father, feeling the familiar rhythm of a long walk toward a place of work. She knew this language of the land, the way a change in the rock signaled water nearby, the way the angle of the sun told the time of day. This was her true inheritance, more real than any deed. After 2 hours of steady climbing, she saw it. The folly was not just a scar on the land, it was a wound. A great landslide of shale and reddish dirt had cascaded down the hillside, burying the entrance under a mountain of debris. A few splintered, silvered timbers jutted out from the rubble like broken bones. The place radiated a profound and desolate stillness. There was no bird song, no sign of life. It felt as if the land itself was holding its breath, grieving the violence that had happened here. The scale of the collapse was far worse than she had imagined. The clerk's words came back to her. A headstone. It was. A massive, unmarked grave of rock and dirt. A wave of despair cold and sharp, washed over her. The town was right. The judge was right. This wasn't a mine. It was an impossibility. What could she, one girl with one pickaxe, do against this? She slid off old Job's back, her legs unsteady. The silence was immense, pressing in on her. It was the silence of finality, of a story that had ended badly 30 years ago. For a long time, she just stood there, staring at the ruin, the weight of her grief and the folly of her hope threatening to crush her. She remembered her father, coming home after a bad day, his face streaked with dirt, his shoulders slumped. He would sit at the table and say nothing, just hold her mother's hand. Then, the next morning, he would pick up his tools and walk back to the hill that had defeated him. "The rock doesn't care if you're tired, Ruthie," he'd told her once. "It only cares if you show up." She took a deep breath, the dry, dusty air filling her lungs. She would show up. She wouldn't tackle the mine today. The sun was already beginning its descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and violet. Instead, she made a small, cold camp in a relatively flat spot 50 yards from the mine's entrance. She unsaddled old Job, rubbing his tired back and letting him graze on the sparse grass. She built a small fire, more for company than for warmth, and cooked a piece of bacon, eating it with a chunk of dry bread. As darkness fell, the stars emerged, a brilliant, silent host in the blackness. The wind whispered through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound. It sounded like voices, like warnings. She wrapped herself in her thin blanket, her father's pickaxe lying on the ground beside her, its steel catching the faint starlight. She was afraid, but beneath the fear, a stubborn root of determination was taking hold. This place was hers. This silence was hers. This mountain of failure was hers to face. She didn't know what she would find, or if she would find anything at all. But she would look. She would work. She would honor her dollar and the memory of the man who had taught her how to stand before a wall of rock and not turn away. The first day's work was an exercise in futility. Ruthie stood before the wall of scree and rubble, a solid, unyielding curtain of earth, and felt a profound sense of her own smallness. It was like trying to empty an ocean with a tin cup. But her father had taught her that you don't move a mountain. You move one rock, then the next, and the next. She began at the edge of the slide, her shovel biting into the loose dirt. It was slow, grueling work. The sun beat down, and sweat stung her eyes, tracing clean paths through the grime on her face. Old Job stood nearby in the shade of a lone pine, watching her with patient, knowing eyes, his occasional snort a quiet commentary on her labor. For days, this was her rhythm. Wake at dawn, drink coffee boiled over the fire, and work until her arms and back screamed in protest. She moved stones by hand, shoveled dirt, and hauled away the debris in canvas sacks loaded onto Job's back. Each evening, she would survey her progress, a small, almost imperceptible dent in the face of the landslide. The town, the judge, the whispers, they all faded, replaced by the simple, brutal reality of the work. Her world shrank to the scrape of her shovel, the heft of a rock, the burning in her muscles. One afternoon, nearly a week into the labor, her shovel struck something that made a dull, resonant thud. Not the sharp crack of rock, but something softer, more forgiving. Wood. She dropped the shovel and began to dig with her hands, her heart beating a little faster. She uncovered a timber, thick and heavy, but as she cleared the dirt from it, she frowned. It wasn't like the other shattered pieces of pine she'd found near the surface. This beam was different, It was oak, its grain tight and dense, darkened by the earth, but miraculously preserved. And its placement was wrong. The other timbers had been horizontal, part of the frame meant to shore up the tunnel's roof. This one was set vertically, driven deep into the ground, and it wasn't splintered from the collapse. Its top was squared off, cut with a precision that seemed out of place in the chaos of the ruin. It wasn't a support beam. It felt like a marker. She ran her calloused fingers over its surface. It was solid, immovable, a quiet anomaly in a landscape of destruction. She didn't understand what it meant, but it was the first thing that didn't fit the story of a simple, catastrophic collapse. It felt intentional. That night, as she sat by her fire, she couldn't stop thinking about it. An oak post, standing like a silent sentinel inside the rubble. Why would a miner waste a piece of valuable hardwood on something that wasn't holding up the roof? Her father had always said, "A mine is a book. You just have to learn how to read the pages." This oak beam was a word she didn't recognize, a piece of grammar that defied the rules she knew. It was a clue, a small, stubborn detail that refused to fit the narrative of Gideon's folly. For the first time since she'd arrived, a flicker of something other than grim determination sparked within her. It was curiosity. The mountain had spoken its first word to her, and she leaned in, ready to listen for the next. The work was no longer just about clearing a path. It was about uncovering a sentence. The oak beam became her focus. Instead of attacking the landslide from the edges, she began to dig around the strange post, following it down. The work became more dangerous. The rubble was unstable and small slides were a constant threat. But the beam was a guide, an anchor in the chaos. A few feet deeper, her shovel struck another. It was a second oak beam, planted parallel to the first, about 4 feet away. Now she knew. This was no accident. This was a structure. A memory of her father surfaced, as clear as the day he'd said it. They had been repairing a section of their own small claim, and he'd held up 2 pieces of wood. "Pine is for holding, Ruthie," he'd explained, tapping the cheap, plentiful timber. "It's honest wood. It groans before it breaks, gives you a warning. But oak—" He ran his hand over the other, heavier piece. "Oak is for hiding. It's stubborn. It holds a line. You use it when you're building something you don't want the mountain to move." Oak is for hiding. The phrase echoed in her mind, changing the nature of her work, from excavation to investigation. She wasn't just clearing a collapse. She was searching for what Gideon Hale had been trying to protect. The days bled into weeks. Her body hardened, her hands becoming broad and calloused, tools in their own right. She and Old Job worked as a team. She would dig and pry, and he would haul the heavy sacks of rock away to be dumped down the slope. He was her only companion, his quiet presence a bulwark against the overwhelming loneliness of the task. He would stand for hours, flicking his ears at the sound of her pick, his deep, slow breaths a steady rhythm against her frantic labor. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would talk to him, her voice rusty from disuse, telling him about her father, about the mockery of the town, about the stubborn oak beams that were slowly, painstakingly revealing themselves. He would listen, his large, dark eyes seeming to understand. She found a third beam, then a fourth, forming a clear, rectangular frame within the earth. It was a hidden corridor, a tunnel within a tunnel, built to withstand the very collapse that had buried it. It became clear that Gideon's death was not the tragic accident everyone believed it to be. The landslide hadn't been a random act of geology. It had been deliberate. Someone had blasted the hillside, bringing it down to seal this place, to bury whatever secret Gideon had hidden behind his oaken gate. The thought sent a chill through her, despite the oppressive heat. She was no longer just a girl trying to reclaim a worthless mine. She was treading on the edges of a crime, disturbing a silence that someone had killed to create. The work took on a new urgency, a new gravity. She was digging not for gold, but for a ghost, for a man whose story had been deliberately and violently erased. Her father's pickaxe felt different in her hands now. It was not just a tool for breaking rock, but an instrument of justice, a key to unlock a 30-year-old secret. The question that drove her now, shovelful by shovelful, was no longer if Gideon had hidden something, but what it was, and who had been willing to murder him to keep it buried. After a month of relentless labor, she stood at the base of the oak frame. The landslide was cleared away from this small section, revealing what looked like a solid wall of rock, neatly fitted between the heavy timbers. But it wasn't natural bedrock. The stones were different sizes, fitted together with a careful, deliberate skill. It was a false wall, a plug. This was the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Everything had led to this moment. She took her father's longest pry bar, wedged it into a crack between two of the stones, and threw her entire weight against it. The rock groaned, scraped, and then shifted just an inch. It was enough. For the next hour, she worked with a focused intensity, leveraging one stone out, then another. Finally, she created an opening just big enough to squeeze through. A gust of air, cool and impossibly dry, breathed out from the darkness, carrying the scent of deep earth and stillness. It was the smell of a place that had not been touched by sunlight or living breath for a generation. She lit a candle, its small flame trembling, and pushed it through the opening. The light didn't extinguish. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she slid through the narrow gap. She was in. The chamber was small, no bigger than a pantry, the walls hewn from the solid rock of the mountain. It was utterly bare, except for a single object in the center of the floor, a heavy tin lockbox dulled with a fine layer of dust. For a moment, she just stared at it, the candlelight flickering across its surface. This was it, the heart of the folly, the reason for the oak, the false wall, the murder. With trembling hands, she knelt and lifted the lid. It wasn't locked. The first thing she saw was the glint of gold. The box was half filled with raw nuggets, not flakes or dust, but solid, heavy pieces of pure, high-grade ore, ranging from the size of a bean to a clenched fist, a fortune. Enough to change her life, to silence the mockery of the town forever. But as she reached in, her fingers brushed against something else, something wrapped in oilcloth. She lifted the packet out. It was heavy, dense with paper. Carefully, she untied the string and unrolled the contents on the stone floor. The first documents were assay reports from an office in Sacramento, not Dustfall. She scanned the figures, her breath catching in her throat. The numbers were staggering, describing a vein of unparalleled richness. The folly was not tapped out. It was one of the richest strikes in the entire region. Beneath the reports were deed transfers, a series of them, showing Gideon Hale buying up the surrounding parcels of land, acre by acre, and then the final document. A bill of sale transferring all of Gideon's land, the mine, the surrounding acres, everything, to another man. The price was insultingly low, a fraction of its true worth. The signature of the buyer was elegant, practiced, and chillingly familiar. Judge Thaddeus Sterling. Tucked at the very bottom of the box was one last thing. A letter, written in a rough hand on a single sheet of foolscap. It was dated the day before the mine collapsed. It was addressed to a brother in the East, a letter Gideon Hale never had the chance to send. It read, "Brother, the vein is richer than I dreamed. But there is a shadow on this place. A man named Sterling, a lawyer in the county seat, knows what I have. He wants the land. He has threatened me, told me I can either sell to him for pennies or be buried in it. I will not be moved. I have hidden the proof of the mine's worth. If you are reading this, it is because he has made good on his threat. Avenge me. The truth is in the rock." Ruthie sat back on her heels, the candle flame dancing in her wide eyes. The silence of the tomb was finally broken. It was filled with the voice of a murdered man, and it was screaming for justice. As if the mountain itself was reacting to the unearthed truth, the sky outside began to darken. A storm, which had been threatening in the high peaks for days, finally broke. The wind rose to a howl, and the sky opened up. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid gray sheets, turning the dry ground to a slick, running mud. A flash of lightning lit the chamber in a stark blue-white glare, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. Ruthie scrambled back out of the chamber, shielding the precious papers under her coat. The entrance to her excavation was a waterfall, a torrent of brown water pouring down the hillside, threatening to undo all her work, to rebury the secret she had just uncovered. The water was washing away the loose dirt and rock around the mine entrance, undermining the very ground she stood on. If it collapsed again, she would be trapped, and the evidence would be lost forever. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. But then her father's voice, calm and steady in her memory, cut through the fear. "Don't fight the water. Show it where to go." She grabbed her shovel, soaked to the skin, blinded by the rain, and lit only by the intermittent flashes of lightning. She began to dig. She worked with a desperate, frantic energy, carving a trench to divert the worst of the flood away from the mine's entrance. The mud was heavy, sucking at her boots, trying to pull her down. Her muscles, already exhausted from weeks of labor, burned with a fire that was almost unbearable. She was on the verge of collapse when she heard a sound over the roar of the storm, a shout, thin and desperate. Peering through the deluge, she saw it. A short distance down the trail, a canvas-topped wagon was mired in the mud, one of its wheels shattered. A man was struggling to calm a panicked horse while a woman huddled in the wagon, trying to shield a small child. They were the Baileys, a family of homesteaders she'd seen in town once or twice. They were trapped, at the mercy of the storm. In that moment, Ruthie was faced with a choice. She could save her mine, her discovery, the proof that could bring her wealth and vindicate a dead man. Or she could help them. There was no hesitation. She left the trench half dug and slid down the muddy slope toward them. "This way!" she yelled over the wind. "There's shelter!" She helped the man, whose name was John, unhitch the terrified horse and lead it to the relative safety of the pine grove. Then, together, they carried his wife, Mary, and their feverish young son to the mine's entrance. It wasn't much, but it was out of the wind and the worst of the rain. Inside the shallow overhang, Ruthie shared what little she had. She gave them her last dry blanket to wrap the boy in, and brewed coffee over a small, sputtering fire she managed to coax to life in a protected corner. She had almost nothing, but she gave it freely. All through the long night, as the storm raged, she sat with them, a stranger who had offered them sanctuary. The gold, the papers, the judge, All of it receded, replaced by the simple, immediate duty of caring for a family in need. She had passed a test she didn't even know she was taking. In protecting the innocent, she had proven herself worthy of the truth she had found. The storm broke with the dawn. A washed, clean light spilled over the ravaged landscape. The Bailey family was weak and shaken, but safe. The boy's fever had broken during the night. John Bailey looked at Ruthie, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. "We'd have perished out there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have nothing to repay you with." "There's no debt," Ruthie replied quietly. She helped them salvage what they could from their wagon and pointed them toward a shortcut back to town. As they left, Mary Bailey turned back. "The whole town calls you a fool for being up here," she said. "They're the fools. You're the kindest soul in these hills." Their story arrived in Dustfall before Ruthie did. It spread from the livery to the general store to the saloon. A story not of a crazy orphan digging for phantom gold, but of a quiet hero who had saved a family from a storm. The narrative about her began to shift, the whispers of mockery replaced by murmurs of respect. Later that day, Ruthie walked into town. She was covered in mud, her clothes torn, her face etched with exhaustion. But she walked with a new purpose. Old Job followed faithfully behind her. She didn't go to the sheriff, who was known to be in Judge Sterling's pocket. Instead, she went to the hotel, where she'd heard a circuit lawyer from Sacramento was staying. She found Mr. Davies in the dining room, a prim, well-dressed man with intelligent eyes. She walked to his table and placed the oilcloth-wrapped packet beside his plate. "I believe this requires your attention," she said. He looked up, annoyed at the interruption from the bedraggled girl, but something in her steady gaze made him pause. He unrolled the papers. He began to read. The room fell silent as people watched. Mr. Davies's expression shifted from mild irritation to sharp interest, then to grim comprehension, and finally to cold, hard anger. He read Gideon's final letter aloud, his voice ringing with authority. When he finished, he looked at Ruthie, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound respect. "Miss Callahan," he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the stunned room. This is irrefutable. This is a reckoning 30 years overdue." At that moment, Judge Sterling himself entered the dining room, laughing with a business associate. He stopped short when he saw the scene. The lawyer, the papers spread on the table, and every eye in the room fixed on him. His face, usually ruddy with confidence, went pale. The laughter died in his throat. He saw the assay reports, the deeds, his own signature on a document of fraud. He saw the ghost of Gideon Hale standing right there in the form of a quiet, 18-year-old girl. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. There was only a heavy, damning silence. The townspeople looked from the powerful judge to the orphan girl, and for the first time, they saw who truly held the power. It wasn't the man with the money and the land. It was the girl with the truth. Judge Sterling, the man who had mocked her, who had called her inheritance a tomb, was undone. Humbled not by force, but by a few pieces of paper and the unyielding courage of one young woman. A month later, the world had changed. Federal marshals had come to Dustfall. Judge Sterling was gone, his empire of deceit dismantled, his properties forfeit pending a trial in Sacramento. The town itself seemed to breathe easier, freed from a weight it hadn't even known it was carrying. The ownership of Gideon's Folly and all the surrounding land was now legally and indisputably Ruthie Callahan's. The news of the mine's true richness had spread, and offers from mining consortiums in San Francisco had come pouring in, offering her sums of money that were difficult to comprehend. But Ruthie turned them all down. The golden hour of a late summer evening found her standing at the entrance to the mine. The scars of the landslide were still there, but now wildflowers were beginning to grow among the rocks. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of pine and evening primrose. Old Job stood beside her, his head lowered, occasionally nudging her hand with his soft nose. She wasn't a frightened orphan anymore, nor was she a wealthy heiress. She felt like something else entirely, a steward, a keeper of a story. She had brought the gold out of the small chamber, but she had left the papers, sealing them back within the tin box and returning them to their hiding place. The mine had given up its truth. Now it could rest. She looked at the dark opening, a place of death and injustice that had become a place of vindication. She thought of Gideon Hale, not as a fool, but as a man of incredible foresight, who had trusted the rock to hold his story until someone worthy came along to read it. He hadn't just been digging for a fortune, he had been building a vault for the truth, banking on the hope that one day it would matter. She reached out and placed her palm flat against the cool, solid rock of the hillside. It felt steady, ancient, and alive. He wasn't digging for a treasure, she said softly to the evening air, to the patient mule, to the ghost of the man who had entrusted his legacy to the earth. He was burying a truth, and in finding it, she had found not riches, but herself. Thank you for staying with us for this journey into the past. This has been a story about the enduring power of quiet conviction, and how sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones that glitter. If you were moved by Ruthie's story of patience and justice, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the frontier. We'll be back next week with another story of a forgotten place and the secret it was waiting to tell.